Okay, I think we're almost on time. Pretty good for us. So welcome everyone. I'm Barbara Slavin. I direct the Future of Iran initiative at the Atlantic Council. And we're going to be discussing an issue today that frankly has been one that's been very close to my heart for a long time. I think going back to Iraq in the 1990s and the impact of sanctions on ordinary Iraqis back during that period. This time we're going to be discussing the impact on ordinary Iranians of sanctions that are ostensibly targeted at their government and at government officials. In the past, U.S. governments have tried to mitigate some of the harm caused to civilian populations by sanctions, but our current administration, while claiming to care about quote-unquote Iranian voices, has made the situation, I think you will see, a great deal worse, including with some new steps on Friday that were supposed to make things better, but we will talk about that. Human Rights Watch has done an excellent report, which I believe is available online. I'm not sure if we have copies outside. There are also hard copies outside on the impact of these sanctions. Maximum pressure, U.S. economic sanctions harm Iranians' right to health. This report specifically looks at the impact on the health of Iranians, their ability to get medicine and medical equipment that is crucial. Before we go into this topic, though, I wanted to say just a word about an old friend of mine who's been unjustly jailed in Iran for the last 4 years. That's Siamak Namazi. In 2013, Siamak presented a report at the Woodrow Wilson Center on this very topic, sanctions and medical supply shortages in Iran. It was the first study of its kind on the issue, and I believe it led to some changes in policy by the Obama administration. Unfortunately, as I said, Siamak is in prison. He and his father, Bakr, were convicted 3 years ago of cooperating with the United States, which is apparently a crime, and they were given 10-year sentences. In a very cruel irony, a lot of the charges against Siamak had to do with his humanitarian work. So this is a shout out to Siamak and his family and to the Iranian government to please let him go. But unfortunately, as we know, sometimes no good deed goes unpunished. So we've had a lot of events at the Atlantic Council on human rights in Iran. In fact, it was the first issue we addressed after the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action went into implementation. And so I should say one other thing, and that is the issues we're discussing today and whatever criticism we are making of the Trump administration by no means absolves the Iranian government of responsibility for its own human rights abuses, which are certainly considerable. But I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time here, and something we've always tried to do at the Atlantic Council. So, with that said, let me introduce our very distinguished panel. First, we will have Tara Sepehri Farr. She's a researcher in the Middle East and North Africa Division of Human Rights Watch, where she investigates human rights abuses in Iran and Kuwait. She is the principal author of this report, though I know others helped. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch, she was deputy director of the Human Rights in Iran unit at the City University of New York, where, among other things, she helped the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Iran do his work. Tara is a graduate of Sharif University of Technology in Tehran. She also holds a master's and master's of law degrees from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and she is a native Farsi speaker. Next, we're going to hear from one of the NGOs that is affected by U.S. sanctions on Iran. Peyvand Sayedali represents the Child Foundation. This is an American nonprofit that provides humanitarian aid and access to rights to vulnerable children, including about 6,000 in Iran. She previously was executive director of Aid Afghanistan for Education, serving out-of-school children under the Taliban. She was a senior advisor to the Swedish Committee in Afghanistan, and she's also served as Afghanistan strategy and policy lead for the UK Girls Education Challenge and worked with Michelle Obama's Let Girls Learn initiative. So quite a good background there. Then we're going to go to the legal perspective. Sanctions have become an industry in this country around the world, and there are many lawyers and others who have become experts in trying to explain sanctions to potential clients. We're very lucky to have Adam Smith with us today. He's a partner at the law firm of Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, where he focuses on international trade, sanctions, and export controls. From 2010 to 2015, he served in the Treasury Department and as Director of Multilateral Affairs on the National Security Council. So he's focused a lot on these issues in the past. He's also the author of 2 legal textbooks and numerous articles. He worked at the UN, also held posts at the World Bank and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And let's see, he has degrees from Brown, Harvard, and Oxford. Not bad. And finally, of course, our cleanup hitter, and we are so lucky. I actually asked Dan Fried if someone from his department could do this, and they were all busy or otherwise occupied. So we have the man himself. Ambassador Daniel Fried is the Atlantic Council's Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow. He's had a 40-year career in the Foreign Service, was ambassador in Poland, served in Moscow, was very involved in helping the countries of the former Soviet Union after the fall of the Soviet Union, expansion of NATO and so on. But for our purposes, we're going to have him talk about sanctions and how they have grown as a policy of choice for a variety of U.S. governments and, of course, the impacts that we have seen. So let me invite our panelists to come up on the stage and take their assigned seats, and we will begin. I feel like tweeting, it's hashtag AC Mideast. We never mind. Thank you. So, Tara, this report has been a long time in coming. I've been bugging Tara. When will it be done? When will it be done for months now? So I'm very glad that we actually have the report. Could you just briefly talk about the main findings of this document?
Sure. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to discuss the findings of our report. Actually, this is not a very conventional report for the Iran program at Human Rights Watch to do. We're very busy documenting the violations of human rights by the Iranian government, and we have a quite full portfolio there. We started doing research on this issue last November after the reimposition of previously lifted nuclear sanctions and getting reports from inside the country that there were shortages of medicine and medical equipment. And it has taken us quite a while to put it together. I want to mention that this is not a report that takes a macro analysis of the impact of sanctions on Iranian economy, but it is a report that basically investigates this question that both Iranian and American authorities are making about the impact, and kind of look into what it means for an ordinary Iranian who is in need of medicine. And the conclusions and findings of our report shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone who has followed Iran and the impact of sanctions closely. It's very short and simple. The existing exemptions for humanitarian trade on paper alone are not effective in protecting Iranians' right and their access to imported medicine, raw material that is needed for production of medicine domestically, and medical equipment. I can explain more in detail how exactly this is happening. I'm going to be brief here, and hopefully in the Q&A we can discuss more. The problem can be summarized as overcompliance by banks, companies, and others don't want to engage with Iran, but it is much more complicated than that. Under the previous administration, as you mentioned, Barbara, Siamak Namazi did this excellent report highlighting how such broad and expansive sanction will inevitably lead to either intended or unintended impact on ordinary people's access to their basic needs. What is different here with the sanction regime that we are dealing with right now is that it has been expanded by very broad designations under different powers of the administration, mainly under terrorism designations. Over the past year, it hasn't been just the nuclear sanctions that have been reimposed. There have been very broad designations that I hope our other panelists can speak more into the impact. But they've also been coupled with a very aggressive rhetoric in public and private by the US administration's officials, sending the message that any potential wrongdoing by any of the entities involved will not go unpunished. That shows our research that we've done by speaking to people who import medicine to Iran, NGOs, people who are familiar with humanitarian trade, and former US government officials show that that has actually had a significant impact on companies and banks' willingness to risk trading with Iran. We have seen letters by banks to their customers refusing to authorize humanitarian exemptions. We have seen several letters by pharmaceutical companies ending their trade with Iran. And one particular case that was very heartbreaking was the case of patients who are suffering from EB, which is a rare genetic disease that will cause very painful blisters on the skin. It causes the skin to become more thin and causes very painful blisters. The company that sells very specialized bandages that doesn't stick to open wound basically refused to sell Iranian counterpart these bandages, causing unnecessary suffering to some 800 patients in Iran. There's been reported shortages of chemotherapy medication and other rare and special diseases such as epilepsy. If I want to summarize it, is that there's no acute nationwide shortage of medicine in Iran at this point. But people who were suffering from rare and special diseases are already seeing the negative effect of sanctions. And if the situation doesn't change, we expect the harm to be even greater. Currently, humanitarian trade is conducted through a very limited number of banks that are willing to authorize transaction with Iran. These are typically the banks that have held Iran's money, particularly from oil exports in escrow accounts, or for whatever reason still have a financial relationship with the bank. Then through the Iranian central bank that distributes subsidized rate of dollar for medicine and medical equipment. Well, for various reasons, this route is under particular threat. With the expansive oil sanctions, I don't know how much money will be left for these trade. With the designation of the Iran Central Bank, it is not clear how some of these transactions can even go forward with no involvement of the Iranian Central Bank. Iranian Central Bank is the principal entity that holds the hard currency and distributes it. There are other ways, for example, the informal hawala system that humanitarian transactions are being conducted, but those are also very risky, they're not transparent, they're not efficient. But we have had people telling us that they're constantly in search of a viable financial route to simply conduct their business. For example, the Secretary General of NRC, Norwegian Refugee Council, a very reputable humanitarian NGO, told the crowd in Washington, D.C. that for a full year they tried to find a bank that would connect the Norwegian bank to an Iranian one so they could basically pay for their operation in Iran. And they still haven't found one that is viable. He said that they spent hundreds of thousands of euros in legal fees just to conduct a study to prove to banks in Norway that such a transaction is authorized under U.S. sanction regime. And there are more examples of that I hope Peyvand can bring up by explaining about the daily challenges of conducting this business. the short story is that Iranians are feeling this impact, and the exemptions on paper alone are not enough. And unless something is done by the US government and other states involved, the situation will get worse because it's not stable. We've had doctors telling us over and over that the situation is not stable. We're taking it day by day, and we're running out of time.
All right. I think that's a good beginning. Peyvan, let's go to you. Tell us about the Child Foundation and your struggles to get your license renewed and to continue operations. Also something about the services that you provide in Iran. If
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so happy to be here. We do have 6,000 children under our care, and these children are sponsored by but these are all by American donors. One of the few American NGOs that is providing services in Iran completely above the law. We're waiting for our license now so that we can continue to do that. And I'm so happy to be here because I think who we are talking about are people who are the most vulnerable in Iranian society, people who don't have the chance to describe their stories, to share their impact. When Tara is mentioning the kids that have EB, I did take the opportunity today in the past few days to speak with a few other NGOs, to speak with the UN, and to kind of get the idea of what's happening on the ground beyond our NGO. We have 29 offices in Iran. None of them have had funds for the past 9 months. So we do have significant experience in what's happening there, with 25% of our students being in some of the most vulnerable provinces in Iran. But when we're talking about vulnerability, when you're talking about these students, these kids with EB, the nonprofit I spoke to lost 10 kids in the past few months that they directly attribute to the effect of sanctions and the availability of medicine. It's a question of affordability and availability. We sampled our kids. 44% of them mentioned medical fears. We in this sample, in this research, we didn't ask them, do you have a medical problem? Do you have this problem? We just asked them to describe how their lives have been in the past 9 months. Everyone is concerned, primarily, as we all are, about health. When sanctions have been going on a long time in Iran. This isn't new. I think it's interesting watching the difference today. In 2012, we all heard individual stories of people who couldn't get medicine, who couldn't afford it, shortages. What I'm seeing happen now is a movement from individual stories to a much more en masse humanitarian crisis unfolding in the works. For us, it's 6,000 children who are fearful every day, who haven't had their stipends for 9 months, kids who depend on it. Speaking with the UN agency, last year saw the highest ever return of Afghans to Afghanistan. There are serious geopolitical issues as well. The most vulnerable people in Iran include the poor that our organization serves. It includes the sick and the elderly that are suffering, and it includes Afghan refugees, amongst others. There are a few million Afghan refugees in Iran. Seeing a record number returning to Afghanistan has a few implications. One, it was also the highest year of conflict-related death and casualty in Afghanistan as well. So they're going back to a war zone. As compared to years past, most of these refugees were found on the northern border, not on the south. Everyone is interviewed as they go back into Afghanistan. So what that means is that people who were in the past staying in Iran, working in Iran, at least cyclically, and then sending remittances back to Afghanistan are no longer. Remittances have gone almost to zero from Iran to Afghanistan, or about 5-10% of what they were. And when President Erdogan makes a comment such as, I could open the gates and flood refugees into Europe, he is including a significant amount of Afghan refugees in that are coming from Iran, with all the humanitarian issues that are related to that are undocumented, their healthcare needs, their security needs. So when we're talking about Iran, we're not just talking about Iranians.
Tell us about your adventures with OFAC.
I will. I think part of what makes our organization unique is that we have had all of the issues you mentioned, the banking issues, banks shutting us down. We've had individuals fully legal, complicit, opening bank accounts, who then were blacklisted from opening a personal account at any bank in the U.S. Because they had opened a child foundation account that, again, fully above board, intended and was very clear about its intention to send charitable contributions of Americans to Iran. So there is this overcompliance is one word, I think, from the bank side, and then this culture of fear that is happening for any NGO or any person who is involved in working with Iran. And in our case, in the case of Child Foundation, we've actually, when sanctions started earlier, years ago, over a decade ago, we had trouble figuring out how to function in the sanction climate, and ended up going through a fairly significant engagement and court with the U.S. government that ended up dropping all charges and finding that from A to Z, Child Foundation's work, as stated, was going from American donors to the kids in Iran. Everything was observed. I can say that we're one of the most heavily vetted organizations sending funds to Iran in the United States. And even so, since new sanctions, we have been unable to renew our license.
And what do they tell you?
Nothing. They tell us nothing. And this is our big question with OFAC. We have shown over 25 years this NGO has been in operation. Like I said, some of the most vulnerable kids in Iran, going to school, preventing them from child labor. And this is what I think is also critical about our organization. In Iran, you go to Iran and you see Child Foundation signs, logos in Tehran, 29 offices, and everybody knows that the funding is coming from American people. So if Secretary Mnuchin is saying that we have issues with the regime, we have sanctions against the regime, but we mean goodwill towards the Iranian people, and we want to express our goodwill towards the Iranian people, then what message does it send when an organization like Child Foundation, all over Iran, one of the most well-known organizations delivering aid, everyone in Iran who is engaged with Child Foundation now knows that they're being blocked from providing the aid that they used to be providing to the most vulnerable. And Child Foundation's students supported also do include Afghan refugees in Iran. And again, what are the few local NGOs? So NRC, you mentioned, is for a year has been struggling. DRC, for a few different reasons, has left the country. The IOM is down to a skeletal staff in Iran. They can't pay their staff. So
This
the
is
UN
the International Organization for Migration.
for migration.
Right.
So local NGOs play a critical role in filling this vacuum. It shouldn't be this case. International NGOs, there needs to be an avenue for all humanitarian support going to Iran. But I think support that is very specific and American donors through completely legal means supporting an Iranian partner organization should be one of the first priorities. But we can't even get a phone call with OFAC. So we have 3 different applications with them proposing various different channels to send our funding to Iran. One is just a simple renewal of the license we've had since 2012. We've renewed it 2 or 3 times. The regulations haven't changed. Our operations haven't changed. Nothing significant has changed. But if it has, we are willing and happy to deal with it, to make the adjustments we need to think of a new route. Mm-hmm. But we can't get any information about that. We're told that it's processing. We call again, we don't speak with anyone. We're told again that it's processing. Finally, we're told about 4 months ago that the application is ready and awaiting signatures. It's 4 months. So, I mean, now we're in quite a significant advocacy campaign, and I have to say, it's been really fascinating to watch many Iranian Americans working through a democratic American system, engaging their senators, engaging their representatives, understanding that these officials are supposed to be working for you. Because again, then we have this fear. If I call my senator, will it affect my cousin's green card application? Will I be in trouble? And we say, this is America. This is a rule of law society, and your senators and representatives are supposed to represent you. So even with senators, representatives calling into OFAC, I was telling our colleague here that we have seen a adverb, did we decide, added to this? They are now actively processing our application.
Actively, oh, that's
Yes.
very exciting.
Yes.
Okay.
So we do have hope, but I mean, I
Maybe
think
today we'll put it over the top. Let's hope
I
so.
hope so, but I mean, the thing that I want to end with here is that I think that you make a very good point, Tara, in your report, emphasizing the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It's not that the U.S. has always been the most respectful of international treaties, but it's signed it though. I mean, not ratified, but signed. But what I want to point out also is that actually the most ratified human rights convention is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Again, the U.S. has signed it. Iran has ratified it, and signees, even though they haven't ratified it, have a responsibility to support the nations who have ratified it in fulfilling their obligation. Not only is the U.S. doing not supporting Iran in fulfilling that obligation, it's impeding it. And when we are talking about sanctions and humanitarian issues, we are talking about a country that is 30% children, qualifies as children.
Thank you so much. Adam, give us some legal guidance here. What's going on? How much worse is it than when you were in office? And also, if you could address some of the new information that came out on Friday. I believe Iran was designated as a jurisdiction of primary money laundering concern. And there was also an alleged pathway put forward for humanitarian transactions that many people say actually makes it more difficult, not easier. So,
yeah, no, thank you, Barbara. It's great to be here back at the Atlantic Council. And it's hard, I think, from the outside looking in to sort of say what's different about the OFAC of today versus the past. I mean, it's actually a black box, even for people like me that used to be in the black box. But maybe stepping back just for a moment, I think just to give you a sense of how financial institutions, which really are the linchpin here, how they think about the world with respect to these issues. Sanctions in general, but Iran sanctions in particular, are unbelievably complicated. They are more complicated than really any other sanctions program. You may think, oh, it's pretty simple, it's all off limits, et cetera. And in some respects, that's right. But it's all in the nuances and how you build it up. You have legislation, you have executive orders, you have huge amounts of regulation that have sort of built up, sort of metastasized since 1979 until present, with sort of ups and downs depending on what was going on with the Iran deal or otherwise. And so the result is an unbelievable morass that then, of course, is made even more difficult by sort of administration statements that are aggressive, usually, unclear in some other cases. Certainly this administration, I think, has been, I don't know if they're undisciplined, maybe that's not the fairest way to describe it, but they've certainly been incredibly aggressive with respect to their interpretations of regulations that the Obama administration may have interpreted differently. And of course, if you're a bank on the outside looking in, the thing you're most scared about is getting it wrong. Because if you get it wrong, the press and prior cases are such that you could end up being fined billions with a B dollars. You could get thrown in jail. There are people in jail. These sanctions laws are actually criminal statutes. There are people who have been in jail, are in jail presently. And in fact, even on the humanitarian/agricultural context where there are broad exemptions, there are cases. Right? In fact, in 2016, there were cases, the ones I could think about, in which medical device and companies were actually fined for delivering medical devices inappropriately under they didn't qualify for the exemption. People who delivered food in the same way. So there's a history here that sort of makes perfect sense if you're a bank. And then you add these risks to sort of fiduciary obligations and otherwise, and you sort of get why their reaction is what it is. And one other piece to this that's important to remember is that sanctions are, in many respects, an outsourced foreign policy, outsourced coercive authority. Instead of dropping bombs, we're asking banks to engage in this activity to provide coercive force on whatever target we have, Venezuela, Iran, and what have you. And what's interesting is that banks have taken to this with gusto for two reasons. Right? One is they actually are concerned themselves with respect to getting it wrong and getting fined and all the rest. The other piece that you got to remember is that other banks and other counterparties have taken on as well. So if you're a bank and someone comes to you and said, I'd like to do a transaction with Iran, can you do it please? They're concerned about their own exposure as a legal matter. They're also concerned about all of the other agreements they may have with other counterparty banks, investors, suppliers, et cetera, many of which have requirements that that bank can't engage work with Iran. Right, so the law says one thing that they're nervous about, they might get it wrong, but they're nervous about it. And then their counterparties in the private sector also are saying the same thing. So they're very nervous of basically being blacklisted either by the government or being blacklisted by the private sector. So all of this sort of makes perfect sense. And I like to say that sanctions, if you think about it as a purely legal matter, their practical grasp far exceeds their legal reach, right? Because of this sort of use of the private sector being so nervous about this. So the impact on Iran in this context is so much greater, I would argue, than probably even this administration, let alone the Obama administration, is really sort of trying to do. And so that piece of it, I think, is what is different here, is that we have a goal in this administration, which might be a little unclear with respect to Iran, but it may well be a regime change or something like that, that was not shared in the prior administration. And so the difficulty, I think, is not necessarily that the laws have changed, because they haven't really, right? The rules are essentially what they are today, what they were prior to the nuclear deal, with a couple of interesting differences we can talk about. But as a general rule, it's still challenging then, it's challenging now, it was challenging then. But it is sort of these statements of the administration of sort of threats and all the rest that I think does make life difficult. Now, to be fair, and Barbara and I spoke about this earlier, and Barbara, I think you were right to reference this in the front, Iran does not make this easy, right? So I spent a lot of time when I was in the government going to Switzerland and talking to pharma companies and banks and everything else. And one of the things I was told is that they're nervous about shipping stuff to Iran and using Iranian banks or otherwise because Iran commingles good with bad, civilian with military, terrorist with non-terrorist, et cetera, et cetera. And so Iran could do more. That's not to suggest that the US government couldn't do more as well. I think we can all agree that's the case. But it is sort of a two-sided street here that we sort of need to figure out what Iran could do to make this a bit better. Now, that leads to sort of the solution. Now, I think everyone knows what the solution is here. And the solution is a pretty straightforward one, and that's a little bit where I think the administration's going from last Friday. And that's something called comfort letters. Every bank in the world that wants to engage with Iran and wants to do so legally wants to have comfort they're not going to end up being fined or thrown in jail. Right? How do you do that? By providing them comfort letters, basically saying, if you engage in activities A through C, we will not go after you because A through C are perfectly compliant with whatever regulations or policy we want. OFAC, as a general rule, does not like comfort letters, right? They're not in the green light giving game historically. They're more in the red light and maybe orange light, depending on the day. And so these comfort letters are sort of, they're the answer, but they sort of go against the grain of the way OFAC sort of thinks about the world. Now, on Friday, the thing we're talking about is OFAC and the State Department working together issued this 4, maybe 5-page document talking about a channel to sort of assist humanitarian products going into Iran. To be perfectly honest, it's not entirely clear what they're talking about because it really at this stage is a 10,000-foot document about basically we're going to demand anyone who uses this channel, which all we know is that it's not going to involve Iran itself or money into Iran, needs to provide us, the US government, huge amounts of information about who you're trading with in Iran, what banks you're using, the counterparties, et cetera. And at that point, you'll be able to get a letter, some sort of correspondence, some sort of thumbs up, I don't know, that provides you that comfort. That's the idea here. I actually don't think that this could make things worse. I think it could certainly provide a rather interesting use of information gathering for the U.S. government. Right?
Do you really think companies are going to want to be part of such a process?
So it's not really companies, it's just banks.
Do you really think they will want to be part of such a process?
If the banks want to engage with Iran, if it's a big enough market for them, I think that they will. But I don't know. I mean, there's still more that needs to be released about how this will work and what the risks are if you get it wrong before we figure out exactly sort of which way forward. I mean, that's sort of the, and then one last thing, we'll talk about sort of this primary money laundering concern issue. So on Friday, the US government officially identified Iran as a jurisdiction of primary money laundering concern, which is a sort of an interesting terminology, goes all the way back to the Patriot Act about what it means. The reality is it doesn't mean much because basically what it does is it requires US institutions to basically deal with Iran with much more concern than they already do. But guess what? They're not dealing with Iran anyway. And so the requirement that this 311, it's called Section 311 of the Patriot Act, requires on parties is, at least in my mind, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it does not seem to be any greater than that which they're already applying to Iran, which is I'm not touching it at all. And then, in fact, most jurisdictions outside the United States are not touching it either. Certainly the major institutions in Europe and Asia are treating this as though it's already happened. So we'll see.
Though.
What's that?
Sounds scary.
It certainly sounds scary. I'm not saying it's helpful, but I'm not sure I'm not sure it actually changes the reality on the ground as much as perhaps people think.
Okay, thank you very much. Dan, you have watched many sanctions policies evolve over time. How would you characterize Iran sanctions under this administration? And on this issue in particular?
Well, sanctions work when the policy they're designed to advance makes sense. And I don't know what the goal of the Iran sanctions are at this. I don't know what the goal is at this point. Is it regime change? A la Bolton? Well, he's gone, but Pompeo has said, Secretary Pompeo has said things that suggest the real goal is regime change. Or is it Secretary Pompeo's list of 13 things the Iranians have to change? And his list is, each item on that list is a genuine bad Iranian action. The Iranians are not innocent. The regime is not innocent here. But is it all 13? Is it most of the 13? Is it 7? Or, as President Trump once said, is all we want that they don't have a nuclear weapon, which is what President Trump said. So which is it? Because those are not the same. So what is our goal? And I don't know. Okay, that's one problem. One area where Barbara and I probably differ, and sort of over the years we've had this discussion, is whether sanctions are, good or not, or legitimate or not. And you remember the Iraq sanctions? You mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, look at what they
Okay,
did.
let's be honest. Sanctions will have a humanitarian impact. And no matter how many times an administration says it doesn't, it does. And I'm not a believer in obfuscation or deceiving yourself. You have to judge it honestly. But, and this is why I brought up Iraq, if I could go back in a time machine, I might go back to 2001, early Bush administration, where they gave up on sanctions against Iraq because they weren't working. And, after 9/11, the alternative to sanctions was war. Like, what's the humanitarian impact of that?
Sure.
I'd love to be able to go back in time and say, wait, you have all kinds of sanctions options that you haven't applied. Here are some people you never heard of. Hire them, beef up OFAC, and you can really put the squeeze on without war. I mention this because sanctions have a legitimate place as a policy tool. If you're not greedy, don't ask sanctions to get the other guy to surrender. They won't. Don't be impatient. Don't write a memo to the president that argues if you just put on tough sanctions, by the end of the year we'll be celebrating a victory. Like, it doesn't happen that way. Trust me, I've written memos, didn't turn out so well. They can work when the policy is serious, when you mean it, and when you're trying to achieve something that is practical. So it worked with Iran under the Obama administration because what we wanted was limited. The JCPOA. That's what we wanted, that's what we got. But then we decided we wanted everything else. So we would go it alone, increase our demands, and go in with no more relative weight than we had under Obama. That's what we're doing in the Trump administration. Well, why do we...
Less relative weight because we don't have the world with us.
Right, somewhat less relative weight. We never needed the Russians and Chinese. We did need the Europeans. The European companies are going to run. They're not going to do business with Iran. So the Trump administration has a point, but somewhat less relative weight with vastly increased demands, I think. I'm not sure what those demands are. So that's a mess. I believe in the use of sanctions as a legitimate foreign policy tool, but that doesn't mean that dumb use is going to work. And I think what we have is dumb use. Okay? And then we get into the problems of the paper. The good news about what the administration rolled out on Friday is, although it is larded up with all kinds of detailed demands which probably make it in its current form impractical, it concedes a central point, which is that humanitarian trade is legitimate, and at the end of some process there ought to be comfort letters. Now, Adam said rightly that OFAC hates comfort letters. I think that's an understatement. I mean, they recoil. So I can imagine, as an old bureaucrat, I can imagine what the administration went through to come up with that document. But they have conceded a central point. And it is if you want to be optimistic, hard, in this administration, especially about Iran, but they have conceded a central point, which is the next issue. What about the practical suggestions in the Human Rights Watch paper? Because that paper actually,
You're doing Tara's job here. Yeah.
well, it was actually trying to come up with stuff. I looked at it, and some of them I think, go too far. Publicly clarify at the highest level the banks or companies faced no legal or financial risk in exporting or financing exempted humanitarian goods to Iran. That probably goes too far, because taken literally, that means that the Iranian regime could siphon a percentage of that off, sell it, use it for nefarious purposes, which they would do possibly for two reasons. One, for the money, and two, to mess with us, right? To cause a problem. I mean, these are not good actors. So I think that goes too far. On the other hand, encouraging other states to establish INSTEC mechanisms for financing humanitarian exports to Iran, I mean, that's an interesting idea. Why not? Why shouldn't State and Treasury take a look at this overcomplicated, overdemanding paper that was issued on Friday and try to work with others to come up with something more practical? Well, the reason is because this is the Trump administration, and we don't like working with other countries, and we like the optics of being seen as maximally tough on Iran. But that's not a bad idea. And if I were in the administration, I would argue that it actually strengthens sanctions by making them more sustainable over time.
Okay. Let me stop you there. I'm going to let Tara talk about
there's more, but
about
there's
the other
this-
recommendations,
Yeah.
but I wanted to ask Adam a question. This was something, back in 2013, we had a task force on Iran here at the Atlantic Council, and we had a bunch of recommendations. One of them was that the US government identify, whitelist, one or two private Iranian banks that had no connection with the government, IRGC, as authorized to conduct certain transactions for humanitarian business, for example, for students who needed money from home in order to pay tuition, for Iranians trying to send money to their aged parents or to get the proceeds from property that they had sold in Iran. A limited number of things with all kinds of reporting restrictions that would make sure that it was crystal clear what the money was intended for. And I remember going with Stu Eisenstadt up to OFAC. I'm not sure if we met with you, if we met with, trying to think who it was at the time, someone at OFAC who patiently listened to us and then did nothing. Why does that idea never go anywhere?
I think it's the same reason. I wasn't part of that meeting. I like Stu a lot. I wouldn't have done nothing. I think it's the same reason that Dan was talking about with respect to a U.S. government announcement that they will have no exposure. Right? The idea of a whitelist, I think, is also from institutions. They do whitelist medical devices, actually. That was a big change.
Okay.
That under the JCPOA, they went from a blacklist system to a whitelist with respect to, basically, if you're trading these sort of stuff, you don't need to come talk to us. You can just do it. So they did move it in that direction. But I think their concern would be that if you whitelist an institution, the likelihood of the institution perhaps changing its spots overnight is not zero. And I think what we've seen in the context of Iran, I mean, the best example for this is Bank SEPA. Right, Bank SEPA is a bank that is basically Postbank, not Bank SEPA, is Postbank, which was the post office bank in Iran. Mm-hmm. That there was basically the average, middle class, even poor Iranians would bank there. But of course, that was also the bank that was doing a lot of missile development financing. Right, so yeah, it's an okay bank, but yes, it's a perfect example of this sort of moving good and bad together. And so I think this was the problem.
You could make it absolutely clear that if they were found to be engaged in any kind of funny business, they would be cut off.
It's also possible, and again, I haven't been in a SCIF in a long time, but certainly maybe there was an argument that it's hard to find a bank that doesn't have some exposure to some nefarious actors in the Iranian government. I don't know. Again, I wasn't part of that discussion, but that certainly wouldn't be surprising if that was a finding that was made.
Okay, it was Adam Zubin.
Fair enough.
Another Adam. Mm-hmm. Tara, let's come back to you. Some of the other recommendations are really good, if you would just tell us a few of them.
Sure, and I would like to have a brief
Rebuttal?
No, not rebuttal, but I think it's actually good to have diverse perspective on the panel. We're different in a sense that it's not our job to advise the U.S. government to be smarter in their policies. We do look at the impact of these policies on human rights. And I think, as Peivan mentioned, what we are trying to offer with this report is not a comprehensive suggestion of how to tackle this issue. We're not sanction designers. We're not people who design exemptions. What we're trying to offer is a human rights framework that seems to be largely absent from the conversation. 2 weeks ago, there was a hearing at the Senate about Iran policy and the maximum pressure policy. There was no single question asked about the humanitarian impact of this. So what we're trying to argue is that this should be an integral part of the policy, and I'm very glad that the ambassador acknowledges that with sanctions as expansive as the Iran sanction regime, there will be these consequences. So our message is clear: think about them and try to address them, because there's an obligation for the United States under international law to consider this. There's as Peivan mentioned, there's the general comment of the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights addresses this issue and assigns responsibility both to the states that are imposing sanctions and the states that are being subjected to sanctions. So equally, Iran is obligated to use its maximum available resources to fulfill the rights of Iranians, and that obligation includes combating government corruption, to use different means such as negotiating with states. We have argued in our report that to reduce the obstacle, they should also consider ratifying anti-money laundering convention. Because we've heard from banks, and particularly non-US banks, that not being part of the FATF system is making them nervous. In terms of some of the recommendations we've thought for the US government, and as you mentioned, these are some thoughts and ideas that we think should be considered. I'm sure sanction experts have a lot more to work with, is basically thinking through designing a viable financial channel. It can be done either by the administration, by the US government itself, with reasonable requirements for companies and groups. Obviously, the Child Foundation NGO doesn't have the same capacity as a multinational pharmaceutical company to hire a big lawyer and conduct a big law firm lawyer to conduct these studies. So there should be some way for them to access the system. It can be a help desk. It can be a person. It can be a robot. It can be one of those chats that when you try to contact AT&T, there should be some interactions to help people walk through the system. If that's not feasible, there are other states that are willing and have offered to be the intermediary. Europe is trying. Swiss government is trying. That's another way. Most importantly, I think we also have to study the impact. We didn't get a response from OFAC. We also didn't get a response from the Iranian government, if anyone is wondering. But we need to have access to information to know how these decisions are being made. Both the administration and the Congress could do that. There are some ways that the Congress could also step in and think about creating clear exemptions for these sanctions, sanction regime. The short message is that, as I think all the panelists mentioned in different ways, the sanction regime on Iran has gotten so expansive and so complex that it's inconceivable to figure out how to navigate it without some actions. These might be some temporary suggestions in absence of a clear policy goal, but that doesn't absolve the US government of the responsibility to tackle this issue. From my research capacity perspective, when we talk about sanctions on Iran, we don't even know what it means. There are all sorts of different sanctions that are not all necessarily for bad purposes or good policy purposes, but this has become just this very complex regime that even the fancy lawyers can't navigate, let alone NGOs and small.
I think the fancy lawyers are doing very well, charging a great deal of money, telling people what they can't do.
Let alone NGOs and others are trying to actually presumably fulfill the stated foreign policy goal of this administration, which is helping the Iranian people in their struggle for human rights.
Yes, indeed. Would you like to add anything, Peivan? I mean, Instex was mentioned. This is something that the Europeans launched more than a year ago, and as far as I know, there's yet to be a single transaction that has gone through it. The Swiss have been trying for over a year to get approval for some sort of channel. And for the life of me, I don't understand why it's been so complicated. I don't know if anyone can perhaps enlighten me on that. We tried, by the way, to get somebody from the European side to speak today, but they declined. So, anyone have any insight?
Well,
maybe someone in the audience might.
I mean, I'm fairly certain. I mean, Instex, the reason, so Instex is I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it broadly is a system that the Europeans have tried to set up so that you can do transactions without touching the US dollar. The thought being that if you don't touch the US dollar, you don't necessarily touch US banks, and therefore you don't have the same sort of problem that you would if you just had a normalized system, which is almost by definition done on the US dollar because the vast majority of trade is done in the USD. The problem with Instex, I think, is the problem it doesn't actually deal with what's called secondary sanctions, right? So what Iran has that is quite nefarious, effective, depending on which side of the fence you're on, is they basically say that you can be sanctioned if you are doing a transaction that the US doesn't like directly. So if you're associated with the US bank, US dollars, or otherwise. But you can also be sanctioned, we can also expose you to sanctions if you are completely unrelated to the US at all and yet engage in a transaction the US doesn't like. Right? It's a with us or against us model. It's called secondary sanctions, which was very, very effective, I would argue, in bringing the Iranians to the table on the nuclear side. But the reimposition of secondary sanctions, which was the principal thing Trump did when he reimposed the sanctions, the impact of that is, as you might imagine it to be, that anybody, if you're making a choice, if it really is being a question of, do I trade with Iran or do I trade with the United States? That's not a choice that most companies are willing to make, right? That as a fiduciary matter, let alone political matter, you're going to choose the United States. And so that's the reality. And so Instex doesn't actually respond to that because you can get out of you can not engage with the US banking system or US dollars, but you can't escape the fact that if you are a European entity engaging in an Iranian trade the US doesn't like, theoretically you could be exposed to sanctions yourself. So Instex doesn't respond to that concern.
My understanding is the US government has not clarified its position on Instex.
No, but they've clarified on secondary sanctions. I think it's enough.
I've seen, I saw statements from Mike Pence in February saying, don't you dare.
Yeah.
And then I saw other statements coming out of the State Department saying, well, maybe it's okay if it's only humanitarian. And I have seen no clarity on this issue. So, again, do we care or do we not care? Is it a question of making people even more miserable? Do we think that's going to somehow result in a better outcome? And we clearly don't know. Would you like to add something? Yeah.
Just quickly to this, and I think for us it's a question of intent. If there is a way to create systems, there is a way to create protocols, there is a way to staff up OFAC to be able to manage inquiries and guidance. Why isn't that happening? Why isn't it worth the expenditure and the effort to do that? So, and I don't know what the answer is to that. Is it a question of staffing? A system like this comes out on Friday. We find ways to work with it. In terms of Child Foundation, our systems actually wouldn't necessarily be affected by Friday's announcement, I don't think, because it's not commodities that we are talking about. It's charitable contributions subject to a different sorts of financial channels and efforts. But then for us, it brings us back to that question, why haven't we received any form of guidance? In the past, it's been 14, 15 months now. In 2012, through 2016, when it was a very same regulations, similar sanctions, we had systems with OFAC. Every 3 months, we gave the receipts of every transaction from point A to point B, and they were filed. There was a way, there was some way, but right now there doesn't seem to be any conversation about it for us.
Can I ask you if you were aware of any NGO or other party being consulted throughout the process of rolling out this new mechanism? Because to the best of our knowledge, people who would have been naturally involved in this conversation, the humanitarians and NGOs haven't been consulted. But I
haven't heard of anybody being consulted. And I think, again, our situation is interesting because we are an American NGO. And it would make sense to be part of that conversation. These are American citizens who are donating. How do we facilitate the right to do this?
You wanted to add something?
Just small, but relevant point. One of the problems that I noticed when I was in government, my last job was State Department Sanctions Coordinator, was that when you ask the humanitarian NGOs to come into the office, it's their lawyers that show up. And the lawyers are not interested, the lawyers want absolute legal comfort. And then you get into this theological discussion because government people are not going to sign away. You're not going to sign a letter that provides absolute comfort. The track record is OFAC doesn't go after humanitarian organizations as a rule. But I remember these bizarre conversations with lawyers whose organizations were sending out humanitarian convoys in Africa in war zones, and their people driving the trucks and distributing the food were taking real physical risks. And the lawyers were fine with that, but they wanted absolute assurance about legal risks, and the disparity between the well-heeled lawyers who were arguing theoretical points when their actual people were taking risks just, frustrated me. So this is not an insolvable problem. But when you go into the conversation, if it were possible to have this kind of a productive discussion at the State Department or at Treasury, watch out who you send, because if your lawyers are leading the group, their standard of comfort is such that you're always going to fail. You got to go in, you have to be there. I mean, people who understand the situation on the ground, because it seems to me you want things to get better. Yeah. And the lawyers are, I guess they're doing their version of their job. But
you don't want to take money away from Adam here. So
yeah, I kind of do. It's okay. He's got enough.
And if I may share an anecdote, I think simply because companies and NGOs are scared. When I was doing research on discrimination against women in the workforce in Iran, I came across some companies that were having discriminatory practices in their hiring. I did something that was very normal for us. Send a letter, ask them some inquiries, because we were interested in working with them to make sure they're pushing the things in the right direction. The lawyers responded saying, we absolutely have no business relationship whatsoever with Iranians, and please don't contact us ever again. They're that scared of being put on spot on this issue.
With that, we have some time now. We have an audience full of other experts, I think. So if you would raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll start over here. And say your name, wait for the microphone. Lady right here. No. Raise your hand again. Yeah, there she is. Okay.
Hi, Negar Mortazavi from The Independent. I think it's a common sort of also a question. There's this back and forth between not just the NGO world, but also the government and also the Iranian government, of everyone basically trying to transfer the responsibility to the other side. Like the government, OFAC, wanting to give the responsibility to the lawyers of the NGOs. NGOs, of course, trying to make things better, not caring about the government repercussions. And then the two governments, the Iranian government and the U.S. government, both basically dodging this responsibility that they both have to the humanitarian situation. But I think the fact that the people are in the middle, the Iranian people, the ordinary civilians basically suffering from all of this on both sides is the main issue here, the main question. How is that basically played out from the viewpoint of the government? I know you're no longer in the government, but you were part of the previous basically sanctions regime, and now how that is seen. Again, it was stated that one of the slogans, I would say, of the administration is that they care for the well-being of the Iranian people, their human rights and everything. But we don't see that in the policy really happening. In fact, it's contradictory the way things are being
Adam,
rolled out.
If you could talk a little bit about the specific steps that were taken, particularly after the interim agreement, the JPOA, was reached to facilitate. What were some of the things Obama administration did then?
So it's definitely true that under the Obama administration, I think Dan would agree, we focused a lot on this issue. Were we perfect? Absolutely not. Could we have done better? Of course. But this was a huge part of what OFAC was thinking about. even before any negotiation, to be honest. There's a whole unit at OFAC in licensing that was focusing on licensing of and figuring out general licenses or exemptions for humanitarian goods and services. So that's a huge piece of what they did, and they were approving dozens. In fact, there was an article, an interesting article in New York Times in 2010. I remember this was right after I started at OFAC, where someone had gotten a Freedom of Information request of all of the licenses that had been granted for, I think, food with respect to Iran. And it was this huge list that had been granted in the past couple of years. So people had actually focused a lot about this. Now, in the lead up to the negotiations, even more was done, I would argue. Or let's put it this way, more was tried to be done. I don't know what the Iranians did with it. Right? So as a part of the JPOA, which was the negotiation before the JCPOA, Iran was given access to some of the money that had been frozen, I use that term loosely, outside the country, the oil money that hadn't been able to be released on a monthly basis. It was given quite a lot of money. The idea behind that was that some of that money was going to go to the people. It's not clear to me that that's what happened, but that was part of the idea. The other piece that started off under the Obama administration, which has now been revoked, is something called the waiver system, which allowed basically Iran's oil sales into certain jurisdictions still buying Iranian oil to be trapped there, like in Japan and Korea, et cetera, but to be used in authorized bilateral trade, which included in large measure humanitarian trade. So basically all of this money in the Central Bank of Iran accounts in places like Asia and otherwise could be used in order to do bilateral trade, which included the humanitarian
and local
products.
banks were facilitating this.
And local banks were facilitated because they could. And so there was some trade. It was not perfect. Some folks were still not interested in doing it for reasons that we've talked about. But that was alive. That system has now been revoked. So the last waivers were revoked in June, I believe, of this year. So in other words, that whole system has sort of fallen apart now. So I agree with you. Now it's hard to see. And then on top of that, thing we haven't mentioned here is that a few months ago, the Central Bank of Iran was sanctioned again. They're already sanctioned. They're sanctioned again, but this time for terrorism. Why is that relevant? It's relevant because one of the primary exemptions you were allowed to use was engaging with parties that were not sanctioned for terrorism. Right? In fact, one of the exemptions to the exemption was that you can engage with anybody in Iran to sell them food or otherwise, so long as that counterparty is not a terrorist, effectively. So now the Central Bank of Iran, which had been a principal sort of conduit of these sorts of transactions, is no longer on limits, right? It's completely off limits. And that actually, in my mind, is what gave rise to this thing on Friday, is that when that happened, huge questions from, and frankly, not just NGOs. I mean, in my world, I talk to NGOs, obviously on a pro bono basis, but clients of mine, right, in the food and pharma space, that saw that as a market, couldn't figure out how to use it. Right, and so at the end of the day, that I think is that combined with the NGO sort of uproar is what gave rise to this thing on Friday, and we'll see whether that's actually going to maybe redress some of what you're suggesting. I mean, I do think the people at OFAC who are principally non-politicals, I think the people who are still there, and many of them I know very well, are still concerned about these issues because they think it's a good policy and it's a good moral judgment as well. But whether or not they can get there is a different question, right? That's sort of above their pay grade, so to speak.
Yeah, Faye, right here.
Thank you. I'm Faye Mokhtar. I'm a member of Atlantic Council. Thank you, Barbara, for such a great program. I have a question for you, Payman. When my husband and I were involved with a Washington chapter of the Child Foundation, he was at the time a president of the Medical Society and introduced the Child Foundation to this society. You guys were doing your transaction through a Swiss bank. And I think one of the problems they have now, one of the excuses they have is that the Iranian banks are not transparent. They're not compliant with international rules. Why can't you guys still continue with the Swiss banks? And the Swiss banks is outside of Iran. At least that's the way you guys used to do the transactions. Thank you.
Thank you. We have had issues with banks in multiple different countries, including Switzerland. It was actually their decision that they couldn't support our transactions anymore. We have worked with banks in Malaysia. We've worked with banks in Canada, with banks in Sweden. There's constantly a searching for a bank that will support, and then contingency plan A, B, and C. And again, it's all because of fear. It has nothing to do with our license being, with our transactions being questionable at all. And then there's the banking side. side on this side, and then there's the Iran side as well, and getting from point A to point B to point C in the final destination. That is very difficult to track in the way that we do it. So we actually don't go through central banks, we don't go through banks in Iran, and that's part of what makes it difficult for the Swiss bank to engage. And there are other limitations there. But the agreement with OFAC was that, okay, we'll do it in this way. Let's spell it out together. We had a plan. We provided the receipts. We went through all the processes completely in a transparent way, and continued doing that with a bit of a loosening in 2016. So as Tara was saying, small NGOs and large NGOs, this is part of the reason I think that we were choosing now. I mean, we chose, again, speaking to the culture of fear, we had a 180-day grace period to keep sending money to Iran in the old way after our license expired, and chose not to do it because we're so scared. But we can do it. We know how to do it. We just will not do it without the license, which is fair. But when you see the larger entities like the NRC and UN agencies, I think it becomes a grander humanitarian issue for them, because they have to use the large banks. They can't do small transaction by small transaction the way we do through an alternative system.
Yes, Peter, right there.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an Intel analyst and a former diplomat. I'm just going to say the B word once, Bitcoin. There are several NGOs in Turkey that have sent thousands of kilos worth of medical supplies over the border to Syria using drones. I'm just saying, it's an option. My question is, have you approached Chris Smith? He's kind of Mr. Human Rights in Congress. And he's one of these guys who can place a phone call and get results within 24 hours.
Can you call him for us?
Well, I don't. A member of the organization should make the case directly to
Absolutely.
Mr.
Have you
Smith.
talked to Chris Smith?
We are starting our outreach to Congress this week. So, yeah, well, I welcome all the suggestions for members who would be open to listening to our argument.
Very good. Let's go, let's see, lady here.
Hi, my name is Rasha Ilas. I'm a journalist and also a former banker. And I know all about the issue of de-risking, which is what you guys have been describing, also called debanking. And it's when a bank refuses or shuts down your bank account, so you've been debanked, or refuses to open a bank account for you because you're considered somewhat risky, and the profit they get from you is just not worth the headache or the compliance headache or the risk that they might take in fines. And in writing about this issue, I find one of the biggest challenges is getting people to speak on the record, because even NGOs and humanitarian organizations are afraid to speak on the record and say they've been debanked over and over, even though they're trying to help people with cholera in Yemen. And of course, this issue does not just affect Iran, but it affects countries throughout MENA region, Latin America, and Muslim majority Southeast Asian countries. So it affects millions of people. It also affects individuals. And my question is, actually individuals like myself, as a US journalist going abroad, I was refused service by banks because my passport says I was born in one of the sanctioned countries. And the banks literally told me, you don't like it, go complain to US Treasury. And I did complain to US Treasury, but I never heard back. And I complained to the US Embassy, but I never heard back. And I was putting cash under my mattress, literally, even though I was working for a US media outlet. So my question is, are there any efforts to pull together all these people who are affected? And it is actually millions of people, if not hundreds of millions around the globe, to lobby, to get on the record, stop being afraid to admit that you've been debanked, not you, you've come forward, and just be open about it and aggressively lobby for change, because without political will, nothing will change.
Anybody?
I mean, debanking, you're 100% right, is a very serious problem. And it's actually a serious problem from a Treasury perspective and a state perspective with respect to their policy. right? Because at the end of the day, what de-risking does is it goes beyond, that's what I was saying about the reach exceeds its legal grasp, right? It goes beyond the regulations that OFAC is trying to sort of engage in. And in fact, one of the big problems with the nuclear deal in Iran was just that, was that it wasn't so much that the rules hadn't changed, because they did, it was that banks weren't accepting that they had changed because of this issue. And Treasury, and I think state now as well, but Treasury is very much alive to this issue for humanitarian reasons and non-humanitarian policy-related reasons. And again, the solution is actually fairly straightforward, right? It's basically these comfort letter ideas of sort of providing people comfort that if they've done the KYC, the due diligence on you, for instance, Bank A is not going to find itself in the bad books because of it. That's easy enough to do. I mean, it's complicated for other reasons. But it's a huge challenge. And again, you're 100% right. This is not an Iran issue, it's a global issue. And there are countries, principally in Latin America, that have essentially lost their access to US dollar accounts because it's just not worth it to folks because of the risking issue. It's a huge issue.
Dan, you want to add something?
If sanctions are going to remain a viable foreign policy tool through the 21st century, we need to up our game in several areas. This is one of them. And OFAC, just as an organization, finds it difficult to devote the resources to manage all of these issues because the sanctions demands on them in this administration have gone up enormously. Their resources have not kept pace. And that mismatch means that the sanctions tool, which traditionally, past 10 years, up into the Trump administration was competently managed, though under stress, particularly under Obama, is going to start to fail. Because without the proper resources, questions like yours will not be addressed, or you will have unsustainable waits for licenses, and the political support for sanctions, which I maintain is a viable foreign policy tool, will diminish, and then we'll lose it. There are lots of things that the Trump administration is doing with respect to sanctions that are bad, like using them as an element of news cycle management with respect to Turkey. After Turkey does something which we gave them a green light to do, like what policy purpose is served? OFAC, my point though is that OFAC had to come up with Turkey sanctions, basically overnight. They don't have the resources to address complicated problems. They need them. And then we need to take, some administration, it probably won't be this one, has to make stepping up sanctions policy an administration priority. It's in-house, it's not flashy, but it's necessary. And the problems you cited are an example of the thing that needs to be tackled to make sanctions viable in the future.
I mean, just real quick, OFAC, just so you have a sense, is a tiny, tiny agency. Tiny.
How many people work there?
Less than 200 people work at OFAC, right? And that includes everything from support staff all the way up to the director. Most of them are lifers who are very, very good at what they do, but the particular interest they can have in any particular issue is very low. There are 60 different sanctions programs, right? 60. Right? Several of them are Iran-related, admittedly, but not all of them. And the reality is that in the government, and I found this out especially when I was at the White House, it's a one shiny ball at a time problem, right? You focus on the issue of the day, and that's about all you can afford to do. And that's certainly true for OFAC. I mean, I think they tried their darndest, and they're working incredibly hard, but there's only so many things. When Venezuela's blowing up, and Turkey's blowing up, and Russia's blowing up, and Cuba's blowing up, there's also this Iran issue that's not blowing up, mind you, but it's a continued issue with respect to not getting licenses or otherwise. This is not an excuse. It's just trying to explain what the issue is here, that the demands are so huge now. This is basically, it's the pointy end of the U.S. government in any foreign policy issue you can imagine.
And how many people work at the Pentagon? I mean,
right,
it
exactly.
is incredible because we ask sanctions to do what we don't ask our military to do.
That's exactly what we're doing.
And how big is our military budget? $600 billion a year? How big is OFAC's budget?
40 million.
And the use of sanctions, I was involved in the use of sanctions after Russia's attack on Ukraine. And I would have loved to have, triple the number of targeters.
Sure.
Let's say going after Putin's wealth, or at least being able to let the Russians know that we could go after his wealth. I mean, there are perfectly legitimate uses of sanctions, of the sanctions tool. But to make it sustainable, you have to be able to address these issues. In my ideal world, you would also reconstitute the office I ran which was a small office at State, which was the sanctions coordinator. You know, it was abolished.
Yes, that's right.
You know,
Why did
there's-
they abolish it? Why did they abolish it?
Because Rex Tillerson believed in clean org charts, as far as I can tell. So, you know, I was replaced by nobody. And the irony was that in a lot of cases, the Trump administration was coming in and wanted to lean more on sanctions, like with respect to North Korea. And then he got rid of my office, which had been arguing inside the Obama administration to do exactly that. So, like, it's one thing to get rid of an office if you think it opposes your policies, but in this case, it was actually trying to advance them and could have helped, and they got rid of it anyway. I mean, go figure. But this is, look, this is, as Adam said, this is not by way of excuse. It's by way of contextual information. You know, from where you sit, OFAC is unresponsive and irresponsible. I get that, right? 14 months, no answer. They had an adverb, actively considering. What does that mean? I totally get that. When you're in OFAC, you're trying to get through the day with people screaming at you for a new sanctions program by COB, which is, again, that's not an excuse. But OFAC, the culture of OFAC is actually a culture of high professionalism. They have managed to retain, and I didn't work this, so this is not self-serving. They've retained their high quality, their professional standards. They're headed by a career person who knows what she's doing. They need the resources to be able to address.
How do we move forward?
Congress.
Whether it's building
Well, yeah,
building-
And an
Congress-
administration that would
Yeah,
propose it.
Congress. There are actually some people in Congress who are aware of the problem, and there's talk about taking a look at IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is the basis for the Sanctions Authority, taking a look at that, putting more money into OFAC, reconstituting my office. There are all kinds of draft legislation, and one of, you know, if it ever comes to it, my suggestion I would make to you all is talk to the Congress about, you know, an office of humanitarian trade, but in OFAC. Don't put it into State. That was one of your recommendations. It'll never work because State doesn't have the authority. And what you're doing then is you're going to get into an interagency fight and you'll lose. Put it into OFAC because you want the OFAC professionals, and they're really good. You want them to own it. And you want the solutions that they will be comfortable with. And then that's when you're going to get someplace.
Okay, let's grab a few more while we can.
Yeah.
Okay, gentleman there,
Bureaucrat.
and then the gentleman here. He's been patient.
Thank you. Ali Arab from Georgetown University. So first off, I want to applaud the work of Human Rights Watch and Tara on this. Putting it in the human rights framework, I think, is the right thing to do, and I want to highlight that as someone who works in the science and human rights intersection. So two questions, and I don't know exactly who will be kind of answering these. One is, as I'm born, raised in Iran, half of my life lived in Iran. So as long as I remember, these specialized drugs were in shortage. The Sezdalban pharmacy is the place to go, long lines, everything. So how much in your work with the Iran or inside Iran or researching on Iran, do you see that their government is relieving the distributional issues within this context? Because as you said, the shortage with drugs is mostly related to the specialized drugs. The other question, I think Adam may be the person to answer, is do you see any place for cryptocurrencies in the future of this, given that also Iran has a very thriving tech groups, and a lot of them are actually non-governmental and quite active in cryptocurrencies?
Sure.
Sure. I'll take the opportunity to explain a bit more about the Iran domestic market. So Iran produces 97% of its medicine internally. So basically, we're talking about 3% of medication that's imported, But that alone might be deceiving, because that 3% is 30% worth of the medical market in Iran. So it's the more expensive, more specialized one. On top of that, we have about 70% of medicine being dependent on imported material. It can be packaging material, or it can be actual raw material. And we covered all of that in the report. And then you have the issue of medical equipment, and that's a completely different. I'm sorry, the medical equipment is 70%. The raw material is something between 30%. I can look at the numbers. But just to say that the picture that we paint is that Iran is dependent on import. But what Iranian government is doing there is also something that might contribute to some of these problems. Iranian central bank has allocated subsidized dollar at the rate of 4,200 toman for basic goods and services. And medicine is at the highest rate that should receive this subsidized currency. But Iran is also aggressively encouraging producers to move away from import. So basically, as soon as a domestic equivalent of this the medicine is available, they really try to shift the resources towards the domestic market and kind of give importers a harder time for importing the alternative. That, I think, can contribute to some of the shortage, but also some of the side effect. We very often hear from Iranian patients that what they're having access to is the lower quality medicine, or the lower quality raw material is being imported. For us not being on the ground, and we asked the Iranian government for permission to travel to do this research on the ground, we were not granted the permission. We're not able to independently verify the side effect. But I think, but I can imagine the government policy also causing some of the problems. Another issue that we briefly touch upon in the report is the issue of government corruption, that comes up in the distribution. Currently, there is a case on trial of actually an importer of medicine who's been accused of tampering with currency. This is to say that, just to backtrack, first of all, from a human rights perspective, these trials have been extremely problematic. Generally, the corruption trials have been very, very problematic, very untransparent. It's not very clear how they're applying the penal code to it. It looks, as an outsider, it looks more like a political fight than an actual serious investigation to go after corruption. But also, it's to say that the system depends on it for survival. When it's been completely cut off the international market, I think the private sector of Iran has paid the highest price. The Iranian government, for operation, for survival, is dependent on all these middlemen and women who are able to move around currency for humanitarian and non-humanitarian purposes in non-transparent ways. So the corruption fuels under the system that is completely non-transparent. But that doesn't take away from the government responsibility to combat them in a transparent way and in accordance with human rights law principle that they haven't done so far. We even have the imposition of death penalty for some of those cases that are very problematic.
Was there a question? Yeah, quickly.
On the crypto issue, really quickly, I mean, there are two problems with that. I mean, I think OFAC is thinking about that, and I think in the future, crypto is going to be a problem. But the problem with crypto and using this as a solution is twofold. One is that it would work so long as you can truly live your life outside the dollar or a fiat currency. Right? So you need to basically have a transaction with an entity that is happy to have crypto and never change that into dollars, because the OFAC has made it clear that even the conversion into the dollar touching the US system is enough to actually get the exposure. The second issue is that you got many players involved here, right? Let's say you do crypto, you denominate a transaction in crypto. That can solve that problem a little bit, but then what about the shippers? What about the logistics providers, the port agents, the insurers, the reinsurance? I mean, the list of parties that actually need to be involved here is very, very long. Each of them would need to buy off on that. And so I'm not suggesting it won't happen in the future. I think it will. I just think we're pretty far away from today to then.
Okay.
Yeah,
We're almost
I mean,
at a...
ask Facebook how it's going. I think there was a certain amount of hype about crypto because it's confusing and has to do with blockchain. It sounds fancy in 21st century. You know, when I looked at crypto, you know, I'm showing my age, but I'm thinking of the 17th century Dutch tulip craze, the first cryptocurrency. You know, it was one of the first financial crashes in early modern Europe. I mean, that's just me.
All right. We're almost out of time, so let me take remaining questions. Gentleman here had a question, and Harlan, you had one too? Okay. And so who else? And the lady over here. We'll take those three quickly. Yeah.
My name is Amina Bari. I'm an engineer, not a historian, but I have a quick question, Mr. Fried and Mr. Smith. First, you said sanctions work. What I know of, a bit of I know about history, didn't work 40 years of Franco, didn't work 50 years of Cuba, hasn't worked on Russia, North Korea, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Iran. So if you could give us a concrete example when sanctions work, that would be great. And then for you, I have a question. We have a saying that in the middle of a fight, you set price. You said Iranians don't make it easy, and you're right. They mix military, non-military. They get medicine distributed to the military hospitals. But then you said they mix humanitarian with terrorism. Can you give us an example of where they have done that? Like terrorism, I know about supporting the Lebanese and supporting against the foreign invasion. And if that's the example, if you have a specific example,
we got it. We got it. Harlan, quickly, one question, and the lady over there, one question. First here in the front row, or second row. Almost front row. Okay.
Thanks. I'm Harlan Ullman. What is the general state of healthcare in Iran today, and what impact are sanctions having on healthcare? Is it marginal? Is it significant? Is it existential?
Okay, and then finally the lady over there, quickly.
Hi, my question is for the ambassador. I know you commented that sanctions can be effective hypothetically if there's a strict policy initiative and you know what you have in mind. What I'm wondering though is if that's the case, how they can really be effective, because in Iran, it seems that a lot of Iranians feel that they're the ones being squeezed, the ordinary Iranians, and Sepah is the ones whose pockets are getting thicker, and there's a black market now and middlemen, and things seem to be kind of targeting the wrong people. So I want to know if that's a matter of changing how the sanctions are targeted, who they're targeting, if they really can be effective if we were to have a particular policy initiative. Thank you.
Maybe we'll start here and just go down the line. So in terms of what is the situation for health? Because Iranians have pretty much universal health care, or at least they have had in the past.
So as you mentioned, Iran has nearly universal healthcare in Iran. In 2015, President Rouhani expanded the healthcare to include many of the rare and special diseases coverage for that. But that has put a significant burden on the government, a financial burden. So many of the pharmacists, basically distributors of drug, and doctors and hospitals are not happy with it, because while it has expanded coverage, and from a patient's perspective, the receiving end is better, the burden currently the system is handling is more significant. So far, there is a rise in the healthcare cost if you look at the family expenditure. And there is the general inflation that has been around 40%, and that's going to impact people. The bulk of the cost is being absorbed by the healthcare system. We have cases of hospitals refusing to provide what they should be providing as part of the treatment, and for example, asking patients to buy it off the market and bringing it as part of the when people are going for operation. We have the system like starting to shorten from the edges, but I would say by and large it has so far held. But because it's already under a huge financial burden, a failure of such system would definitely be devastating. But the bulk of the cost is now being absorbed by the government, particularly in more disadvantaged and rural areas.
Okay. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would add to that, and just to reinforce it, it's the people who are the most vulnerable are the ones who are on these margin areas. So while the effect of changing healthcare availability and affordability may not be pervasive, what we are seeing is that those who are already vulnerable and already have to choose between how they spend the small amounts of money they have that can now buy less, their number one fear is, according to our survey, it's medical, it's healthcare. So again, I think it's a question of affordability, availability, and the most marginalized being the ones who are suffering.
It sounds like America.
No, it's better than that, actually.
Yeah.
Terrorism, prove it.
No, I mean, it's a great question. It's a fair question. And I think it depends on your definition of terrorism, is always the case, right? I mean, but obviously the U.S. has a pretty clear definition that is that if you are sanctioned as a specially designated global terrorist, you are involved in terrorism activities. And so now the Central Bank of Iran is that, IRGC is that, Hezbollah is that. And so yes, any activity that the U.S. views as is involving those entities is necessarily involving terrorism. If you're adding on, commerce on top of it, like the bunyads, or adding humanitarian stuff on top of it, hospitals or otherwise, that is the link that the U.S. government is identifying.
Yeah. And the final, when have sanctions worked? I mean, clearly not with Cuba.
Well, certainly. I mean, Cuba's a textbook case of dumb sanctions. Didn't work. 1980 sanctions worked in South Africa against the USSR and communist Poland. 3 success stories. They didn't work exactly according to the timelines of those who implemented them, but hey, look at the three countries then, look at them now. Sanctions were one of the factors, not the only factor. Sanctions worked in Serbia in the late 90s. Again, not according to the timetable the advocates had put down, but Milosevic, the dictator who started the wars, was overthrown. Sanctions had something to do with that. More recently, I can cite 4 examples of partial success of sanctions. Iran brought us to the JCPOA. Sanctions were a factor. Russia, after the invasion of Ukraine, Russia pulled back from its maximum war aims. And, I could go into detail. Burma, I mean, the military regime surrendered some of its power. You're going to talk about the Rohingya, and I would agree, but the purpose of the Burmese sanctions was to get the military out of power and get Aung San Suu Kyi, into some power. They succeeded. And DPRK, maybe. I think the increase of sanctions under the Trump administration got Kim Jong-un's attention. The trouble was, later, what is it we want? That's another discussion. But I mean, sanctions can work if you're not greedy and you're not impatient. And for more on that, I will do a shameless plug for the Atlantic Council Sanctions Initiative. We go into all of this stuff all the time.
We do. Okay. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you so much to my speakers. Very good conversation. With a man who recovered and returned to Iran a precious copy of the Shahnameh. So watch your listings for that. It's going to be a cultural conversation and also something about U.S.-Iran relations. His name is Arthur Hooton, I believe it's pronounced. And he recently went to Iran. He's making a documentary about the return of this very precious medieval Shahnameh. He's an interesting character, so please come. Thank you.